If you put these two images side by side and compare them, and then you say, how do you read these two images relative to each other, then I think most people would say that relative to one another, the image on the top depicts a man who is at ease, a man who is at peace, a man who perhaps is complacent, perhaps. The image below seems to point to stress, anxiety, fear. So when you compare these two images, you get two very different senses. And what I do then is in my classes is I use these images as an entry point into a discussion of two very different environments. We're talking about the environment of ancient Egypt, and we're talking about the environment of ancient Mesopotamia. And here we're speaking in very general terms. But we have two very different environments that seem to have very different implications for how the cultures work out, but also how the cultures feel. Cultures have certain tones. To use kind of an old-fashioned word, cultures have certain vibes. We can see this around us. There is the vibe, there's the tone of the small town. There's the vibe, there's the tone of the big city. And then if you travel from state to state, you'll notice that states have different vibes, have different tones. If you travel to different countries, you'll notice that different countries have different vibes and different tones. And a lot of times I think that has something to do, at least something to do, with environment. And so the image there on the top comes just from ancient Egypt, the image on the bottom there from ancient Mesopotamia. And the simple point being that environment matters. And as we look at Egypt, as we look at Mesopotamia, and we see how these cultures have different vibes, how they have different tones, then maybe environment has something to do with it. And it's worth thinking about. Because often it happens in life, we'll get to know somebody and we'll learn about their traits and their personalities and their interests and kind of where they're coming from, etc. And then we'll learn something about where they came from, something about the environment they grew up in. It could be the environment of a community, it could be the environment of a country, it could be the kind did they grow up in the country, did they grow up in a city, did they grow up in Central America, did they grow up in Canada, did they grow up in Japan, did they grow up in Fiji? And a lot of times when we get to know somebody and then we learn about where they grew up, the environment in which they grew up, then a lot of times the things we learn or the things we know about them maybe make more sense. So environment matters. One of the things that struck me as I was thinking about this is you see Egypt, this great power of the ancient world on the left, Mesopotamia, this great power of the ancient world on the right. And in between there, in the red, you have Canaan, which we associate with ancient Israel, with the ancient Hebrews. And one of the things that's interesting about the ancient Hebrews is that a lot of their stories have to do with unlikely heroes, with unlikely people who do heroic things, who take on great power. Now, the story of Moses, for example, he comes from the Hebrew people, right? And the Hebrews, as described in the Old Testament, as described in the book of Exodus, the Hebrews are slaves. So the Hebrews are relative nobodies compared to the upper classes of Egypt. Now it just so happens, as the story works out, that this baby boy who's born to these nobodies within that context actually is raised among royalty in Egypt. So Moses did have a high class, I'll say, upbringing, but he was still one of these Hebrews. That is, as a result of his parentage, right? He was could be counted among the slave class, even though he had grown up in royalty, at least in terms of family tree. But we are told in the story also that Moses had a speech impediment. We see in the story that Moses did not want to play a really important historic role. And yet Moses is the person that is selected by the Hebrew God to challenge the great power of Egypt to liberate the ancient Hebrews from the power of ancient Egypt, to liberate them from slavery, etc. And so we have an unlikely person doing amazing things in the face of great power. The case of David and Goliath, I think this is sort of a classic case where you have a young Hebrew boy, right, who takes on this giant from this enemy force. In the case of Esther, the story of Esther, you have a young woman who in the context of the day isn't going to have a whole lot of power. She takes a risk. As a result of that risk, then her people are saved from annihilation. This is a theme in Hebrew literature, and it's picked up in Christian literature, that is in the Christian Gospels, where we see the key figures of the Gospels in that early Christian writing. One key figure is John the Baptist, this prophet who lives in the desert. He eats locusts and honey. And then Jesus himself is born in an insignificant town. Here's a theme from ancient Israel that also plays out in early Christianity, the theme of kind of nobodies who become really, really important somebodies and who challenge the powerful. Well, where did this idea come from? Well, that's probably a complicated question, but I think it might have to do a little bit with environment, just looking at it historically. Because here you have a relatively weak people, right? A relatively weak people, trounced on by other powers, enslaved by other powers. Jews are enslaved by, the ancient Israelites are enslaved by Egyptians, they're enslaved by Greeks, they're enslaved by Romans, right? They're enslaved by Babylonians. And so the ancient Hebrews, the ancient Israelites, they're not a powerful people relative to the great powers around them. And yet, they have these heroes who take on the great powers. So where did this idea come from, that weak people can take on great powers? I think the environment that ancient Israel was in, I think that helps to explain kind of where this kind of storyline comes from, of the weak taking on the strong. So I hope you can see how an environment maybe played some role in shaping that ancient Hebrew interest in the weak taking on the strong. Well, we can reflect on this in our own world. Suppose that we grew up in this kind of environment. I mean, as we speak, there are people in the world who live, right where this photograph was taken. And they live in a kind of environment where these kinds of sights are normal. Well, then how might that shape our outlook on the world as we carry on in life? Or here's another photo that shows up in one of the different videos we made. In this case, we're looking at an alley that is spotless. There's not even a tiny shred of trash anywhere in sight. Again, there are people living right at this moment exactly where this photograph was taken. If you grew up in this kind of environment, then how does that shape your world? How does that shape how you look at the world, what you think about the world, how you approach the world? Now, in this case, we're talking about human environments, but because, of course, humans act within the natural environments they live in, and then they create their own human environments within those natural environments. But both environments affect how we see the world, how we act in the world, how we think about the world, how we conduct ourselves, the assumptions we have, the expectations we have, etc. I'm going to show you a brief video of an ambulance that's trying to get through this traffic, but it's absolutely hopeless. And the traffic in this city is chaotic. Now, of course, this ambulance is trying to get to somebody who really needs help, but the ambulance can't get there. If a person grew up in that kind of environment, what kind of impact might that have on how that person approaches the world, how that person sees the world? Or put the question, to yourself. If I grew up in this kind of environment where people need help, we call the ambulance comes, but the ambulance can't break through because the traffic is so thick, right? And it's not that just happened to happen, but that predictably happens. Then how does that shape our thinking? How does that shape our outlook on the world? Let's watch the video briefly, and then we'll come back. So that's a really tough scene, right? Somebody needs the ambulance is trying to get through, but the traffic is so thick the ambulance can't get through. How might that shape how a person sees the world? If a person grows up in that kind of world, where you say, oh, we had an emergency, we called the ambulance came, but the ambulance could not get here. It took a very long time for the ambulance to get here because the traffic was so thick. And that wasn't just something that just happened, it was predictable, right? And notice that there's no arrangement for the ambulance to get through. There's nowhere for these cars to go, right? And so the ambulance is just as stuck as everyone else. If you grow up in that kind of environment, how might that shape your world? Now here, of course, we're talking about human-made environments, right? So you can see elements of the natural environment, the trees, but this is human-made environment. So we've got levels of environment at work. Now here, though, we have an image of natural environment. Now people can live in this kind of environment and they create their little human environment, but here we're looking overwhelmingly at natural environment. If you grew up in this kind of environment, right, where the weather is, about between 85 and 95 degrees all year, right? You have two seasons. There's the hot, dry season, and there's the hot, wet season, right? Food is abundant, right? You grow up in this kind of environment, how might your outlook on the world be different? How might the outlook on the world that you have be different as a result of growing up in this environment, or as opposed to growing up in this environment or growing up in this environment? What about if you grow up along a river and your life is dependent on the river? You don't have a car, you have a boat that gets you around, and you put your bicycle in the boat. And how might that shape your view of the world if your upbringing, if the circumstances of your upbringing are created around a river and the life of the river? What difference might that make? What about if you grow up in an environment where it's 120 degrees and even higher many, many, many days of the year? Not, 100, in recent news in Los Angeles, in parts of Los Angeles, it was 121 degrees. And that was national news. I mean, that is really hot for LA. LA is a warm city, right? But 121 degrees is really hot for LA. And I think that happened one day. What happens if you grow up in a place where temperature of 120 degrees, you're going to see that 50, 60 or more days out of the year? What difference might that make? How might that environment shape your view of the world? Or let's say you live in a place where it's basically winter 8 months out of the year, where it's dark much of the year because you're so far north, right? Where the temperature will be below freezing for many days out of the year. How would that change your outlook on the world? How might that affect how you see the world, the kind of assumptions that you have about the world? So environment matters. I think everybody would agree with that. I think as we move on in life and we ask questions about ourselves, why do I approach the world this way? Why do I have these dispositions? Oftentimes we can think about the environments we grew up in, the natural environments we grew up in, the human-made environments we grew up in. So these things are very important. It's important to remember, of course, that ideas can be more powerful than environment. And I want to go back to the ancient Hebrews. It's so interesting to me that the ancient Hebrews, relative to the Egyptians, relative to the Mesopotamians, relative later to the Greeks, relative later to the Romans, the ancient Hebrews, the ancient Israelites, were not a powerful people. And yet, they end up being historically probably the most influential people ever, right? How is it that a people of little historical significance in their own day could have ended up being so important globally? And what I mean by that is Hebrew ideas, Hebrew assumptions have been adopted by people all around the world. we think of the major religions of the world. You can't have Christianity if you don't have the ancient Hebrews, and you can't have Islam if you don't have the ancient Hebrews. It's hard to see how you have either Christianity or Islam if you don't have the ancient Hebrews. And it's interesting, the ancient Hebrews had no art. They left no statues. They left no no trinkets and things like that. Not that I'm aware of, and certainly not much, if any of that does exist. One of the things they did leave, of course, is their writing. The Hebrew scriptures, what we call the Old Testament. And it's very interesting, these ancient Hebrew people who in their own day did not have much power, and they have these stories about weak people taking on the strong, weak people taking on the strong. You understand? Well, where would they come? Where would those ideas come from, right? Those ideas that lead to these stories about the weak taking on the strong, etc. David's idea that he could take on Goliath. Esther's idea, with the encouragement of others, that she could do something courageous to save her people from annihilation. Well, I think this idea of the weak taking on the strong, there must be at least partly an environmental explanation, because the ancient Hebrews are relatively weak. But they also had an idea that was a very powerful idea, and this idea had to do with their God. The Hebrews were unusual in that they said there's only one God. That's not normal in their part of the world, in the ancient world. The Egyptians thought there were many gods. The Mesopotamians thought there were many gods. The Greeks thought there were many gods. The Romans thought there were many gods. The Hebrews are unusual. The Hebrews just say one. There's only one. And this God is more powerful than all of the other gods. As a matter of fact, none of the other gods exist, right? That's how weak they are. They don't even exist. There's actually only one God. And this God is the most powerful of all gods. So it's very interesting that Hebrew identity gets attached to the idea of this one great God, right? This one great powerful God. Despite all appearances, the Hebrew God is greater than all of the gods of Egypt, than all of the gods of Mesopotamia. It's a powerful idea that, just historically speaking, I think, motivates ancient Hebrews to write down these stories of David and Goliath, these stories of Abraham, the stories of Moses, these stories of Esther, right? These stories of courage, of fallible human beings in cases of really messed up people accomplishing great things, right? Well, this idea of being weak amidst the strong, we understand that from the environment. But then they have this other idea, though, but our identity, though, is attached to the one great God. And perhaps that idea, the motivation that idea provides the ancient Hebrews, perhaps that's one of the things that helps to explain how a people who were so weak in their own day could end up being so incredibly influential globally for thousands of years afterwards. So environment matters. Environment is important. Ideas are also important. And if people grow up in difficult environments, and of course many people do, that doesn't mean that they're doomed, because ideas are important and ideas can prevail. And so it's very important to create the best environments we can, to take care of the natural environment, to create the best human environments we can, and also to be aware of the best ideas and to think well about those best ideas.